Welcome back to Myths Unraveled. Like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Abyzou's origin is shrouded in mystery, with various interpretations depending on the cultural context in which her tale is told. In the earliest accounts, she is depicted as a spirit or demon that arose from the darker aspects of the natural world, a figure born from the intersection of human suffering and cosmic forces. The transformation of Abyzou from a spirit of misfortune to a demon bent on destruction reflects both the ever-present human fear of the unknown and the desire to give shape to the inexplicable suffering that plagued ancient societies. To understand the essence of Abyzou, one must first explore her beginnings and the transformation that made her such a terrifying figure in folklore. Her origins can be traced to the Near East and parts of European folklore, regions where concepts of demons and spirits were deeply entwined with the everyday struggles of life. In these societies, childbirth was a dangerous and often fatal endeavor, and the early years of a child's life were fraught with potential threats. In these cultures, the fear of spirits and unseen forces could not be overestimated. The very real danger of miscarriage and infant mortality cast long shadows over families, and it is from these fears that Abyzou's myth likely took shape. She became associated with the worst of these dangers: miscarriage, stillbirth, and the death of newborns. As her legend grew, so too did her association with envy and jealousy, particularly surrounding her own inability to bear children. In the beginning, Abyzou was not a demon in the strictest sense. Rather, she was a spirit, possibly a type of earthbound being, who represented misfortune or bad luck. The cause of her bitterness and jealousy can be traced to her own infertility. In some versions of her myth, Abyzou was once a beautiful woman, blessed with everything a person could desire except the ability to conceive. Her transformation into a demon was the result of this unfulfilled longing. Envy festered in her heart, an emotion that, in the mythic world, is often portrayed as something so powerful that it can alter the very essence of a being. Over time, Abyzou's jealousy turned violent, and she began to wreak havoc on the lives of women who were pregnant or giving birth. Her bitterness over her inability to have children manifested as a malicious desire to destroy the children of others. She did not simply wish for their death, she sought to make their deaths happen in the most tragic ways. The jealousy that Abyzou felt for mothers and their children became her driving force, and it made her a formidable and terrifying figure. She was not just a passive observer of others' fertility, she became an active agent of death, a being whose very presence could endanger the lives of those who were most vulnerable. The shift from spirit to demon also reflects broader cultural shifts in how evil and misfortune were perceived. In ancient times, spirits were not necessarily seen as inherently malevolent. They were often part of the natural order, embodying the forces that humans could not control or understand. But as societies began to develop more rigid moral codes and religious systems, these spirits started to take on more sinister roles. Abyzou's evolution into a demon was a direct result of the way humans began to interpret misfortune, not just as an inevitable part of life, but as something caused by evil forces that sought to ruin the lives of the innocent. This shift mirrored a growing understanding of the world as a place where forces of good and evil were in constant conflict, and where the actions of malevolent beings like Abyzou could alter the course of human lives. Her story also reflects the deeply ingrained belief in the supernatural in ancient societies, where everything life, death, fertility, and even the weather was seen as influenced by spirits, gods, and demons. The idea of supernatural beings governing or influencing natural processes was common, and Abyzou's myth fits neatly into this worldview. Her ability to interfere in the delicate process of childbirth made her a figure of dread for any woman who was pregnant or had recently given birth. It is in this light that her transformation from a simple spirit to a vengeful demon becomes even more significant. The belief in the supernatural causes of misfortune was so powerful that it led to the creation of figures like Abyzou, who represented the forces that could not be controlled but could certainly destroy lives. One of the central themes in Abyzou's myth is the idea of imbalance. She embodies a deep imbalance in the natural order, one that arises from the very real suffering of women unable to bear children. This theme of imbalance is common in many myths where a character's desire or jealousy leads to their corruption or destruction. In Abyzou's case, her desire to have children was not just a longing but a consuming obsession. Unable to achieve motherhood herself, she took it out on others by seeking to rob them of what she could not have. Her jealousy was not just personal but cosmic, affecting the balance of life itself. This notion of imbalance, of a force that exists because of envy or desperation, underscores her role as a demon. She is not merely a spirit of misfortune, but an active force in the world that seeks to right a wrong, not by bringing fertility or life, but by destroying what is precious to others. As Abyzou's story evolved, so did her role in the broader context of folklore. She came to be viewed not just as a cause of suffering but as an embodiment of the destructive power of envy itself. The more her myth spread, the more she was associated with other malevolent female figures in folklore, such as Lamia and Lilith, both of whom shared her themes of jealousy, infertility, and the harm of children. Abyzou's transformation was not just a personal one, it was a cultural transformation, one that aligned her with other figures in the mythic tradition who represented the darker aspects of womanhood. These figures often serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked emotions, particularly jealousy and envy, and they reveal a deep fear of female power when it is wielded destructively. Abyzou's myth also reflects the ancient fear of death and loss, particularly the loss of a child. The idea that a supernatural force could be responsible for such devastating outcomes would have been terrifying in a world where infant mortality was common. Ancient societies often had few ways to explain why some children survived and others did not, and the belief in malevolent spirits like Abyzou allowed people to make sense of these tragic losses. These spirits were not seen as random forces, they were personalized, given names, and often imbued with specific characteristics. Abyzou's jealousy was not just an abstract feeling, but a driving force that led to the very real suffering of mothers and their children. In the end, Abyzou's transformation is not only about her individual jealousy, but about the ways in which cultures have tried to understand and personify the darker, uncontrollable aspects of life. Her myth reflects a deeply human need to explain suffering and to give shape to the forces that seem to govern life and death. In her we see the fear of the unknown, the terror of loss, and the destructive potential of envy. These themes are timeless, and they continue to resonate today as we grapple with the mysteries of life and death, fertility and loss, and the forces that shape our lives in ways we cannot always control. Abyzou's jealousy was not simply a feeling, it became a consuming force that defined her very existence. In the myth, this emotion served as the foundation for her transformation from a spirit of misfortune into a demon who actively sought to inflict suffering on those she deemed to have what she could never attain, motherhood. Her infertility, an affliction that left her bitter and vengeful, created a deep well of envy that she could not overcome. This jealousy of mothers and children became the driving force behind her actions, and it gave rise to a relentless thirst for destruction, particularly targeting pregnant women and newborns. Her hatred and jealousy were not just personal afflictions but cosmic forces that wreaked havoc on the lives of others. The crux of Abyzou's malevolence lay in the imbalance she felt between herself and those who were able to bear children. Her inability to become a mother led her to envy those who could fulfill this natural and divine role. In a world where women's value and identity were closely tied to their ability to bear children, Abyzou's envy became a source of power that grew more destructive the more it was allowed to fester. In some interpretations of her myth, Abyzou's desire for a child was so all-consuming that she could not bear the idea of others experiencing the joy of motherhood. Rather than seeking out ways to heal or solve her infertility, she allowed her jealousy to define her existence. This resulted in her becoming a dark figure, one whose desires were twisted and perverted to a point where she could no longer even comprehend the value of life in the way other women could. The destruction Abyzou wrought was not random or mindless. It was targeted and deliberate. She attacked the most vulnerable, expectant mothers and their unborn or newborn children. These attacks were said to take many forms, from causing miscarriages to ensuring that newborns died in the early days of their lives. She was a demon of suffering, one whose influence was felt deeply during one of the most fragile periods of a woman's life. The vulnerability of childbirth and the innocence of newborns gave Abyzou's attacks a particularly cruel edge, as she seemed to delight in robbing women of the joy and hope that new life represents. The very process of life, in her twisted mind, became something she could destroy with a mere thought, turning what should have been a joyous occasion into one of grief and loss. Abyzou's role as a harbinger of death for the unborn was not only tragic but profoundly unsettling. The idea of a supernatural force wielding such destructive power over life's beginnings reinforced the fear and dread that parents, particularly mothers, felt during this period. Her ability to directly influence the outcome of pregnancy made her a figure that loomed large in the minds of women, creating a sense of helplessness and anxiety over the process of childbirth. This fear was rooted in the ancient understanding of birth as a dangerous and unpredictable event. Many societies had no real understanding of the medical causes behind miscarriage or infant mortality, and so they turned to the supernatural to explain the inexplicable. Abyzou in this context became a symbol of all that was wrong with the natural order, a demon who sought to unmake the creation of life by targeting those who had the power to bring it into the world. Her jealousy was not just rooted in her personal inability to have children, but also in the way society at the time viewed fertility as a divine gift. To be fertile was seen as a blessing, one that connected a woman to the divine and to the natural world. But for Abyzou, fertility was a curse, a reminder of her own inability to partake in the sacred act of creation. It is this deep sense of inadequacy and bitterness that twisted her into a figure of evil, a demon who, rather than seeking to reconcile with her own desires, sought instead to destroy the happiness of others. This sense of imbalance, of something being fundamentally wrong with the world, is central to understanding Abyzou's motivations. Her jealousy was not just about the loss of a child, it was about her perception that she had been unjustly denied something that others took for granted. This existential imbalance, this fracture in her being, transformed her from a spirit of misfortune into a malicious, vengeful force. As Abyzou's jealousy festered, it became clear that she was no longer just a victim of her own desires. She had become an agent of chaos and destruction. Her power was no longer limited to causing suffering indirectly, but had transformed into an active predatory force. She sought out pregnant women, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she could strike. Her presence was marked by an atmosphere of dread and unease, as though the natural order itself had been disrupted by her twisted desires. The very air seemed to grow heavier as Abyzou approached, and the birth of a child became an occasion fraught with danger. Mothers who were pregnant or had recently given birth were the most vulnerable to her influence, as her powers seemed to be strongest at those moments when life was most fragile. It was as though she thrived on the energy of life itself, feeding off the vitality of those who carried new life within them. The innocence of a child, the very thing that should have been protected and celebrated, was instead something that Abyzou sought to destroy in her jealousy. The acts of destruction Abyzou committed were not only physical but psychological as well. The fear of her presence, the knowledge that she could strike at any moment, created a state of constant anxiety among women. The threat of miscarriage or infant death, once seen as random or accidental, now took on a darker dimension, one that seemed to have a malicious purpose behind it. Women became increasingly wary of their own bodies and the pregnancies they carried, haunted by the idea that their children might be taken from them at any moment by a force beyond their control. This created a sense of powerlessness, where women could not escape the feeling that their own fertility was not a blessing, but a potential curse. The knowledge that a demon like Abyzou might be watching, waiting to exact her revenge, eroded the sense of safety and control that every mother should have. In her jealousy, Abyzou also became a reflection of the wider cultural fears surrounding female fertility. In societies where fertility was central to the role and identity of women, the fear of infertility or the loss of a child was a terrifying one. Abyzou embodied these fears in her most extreme form, representing the nightmare that every woman carried with her, the loss of her ability to bear life, or to protect the life she had created. In this sense, Abyzou's myth was a manifestation of the anxieties of an entire culture, one that placed great value on fertility and motherhood, but also feared the devastating consequences of its loss. Her jealousy was not just personal, it was emblematic of the broader cultural landscape, one where women were revered for their ability to create life, but where that power also carried with it the ever-present possibility of tragedy. Abyzou's malevolent actions and the fear she invoked were also tied to the ways in which ancient societies understood death and the afterlife. The death of an infant was considered particularly tragic, as it represented not just the loss of life, but the loss of potential, of a future that would never be realized. Abyzou's role as a bringer of death to the most innocent and vulnerable members of society, unborn children, turned her into a figure of deep sorrow and terror. Her attacks on pregnant women and their children could be seen as an attempt to unmake the future itself, to destroy the very possibility of life before it even had a chance to flourish. By targeting those most connected to the cycles of life and death, Abyzou became a symbol of the ever-present fragility of existence and the fragile balance between creation and destruction. The mythology of Abyzou serves not just as an explanation for the tragedies of miscarriage and infant mortality, but also as a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of envy and bitterness. Her transformation from a spirit of misfortune into a demon of death is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotions, particularly jealousy. It is a story that speaks to the human condition, reflecting the deep emotional wounds that can arise when desire, longing, and envy go unaddressed. Abyzou's jealousy is a force that cannot be contained, and in her pursuit of vengeance, she becomes a representation of all that can go wrong when one's desires are consumed by negativity. Abyzou's transformation into a being of malice and destruction was not an instant event, but rather a slow and tragic evolution shaped by her own experiences, emotions, and the cosmic forces that governed her existence. Her envy and jealousy were at the core of her identity, but what truly made her into a demon of such formidable power was the weight of her own personal trauma, and the way in which the world responded to her suffering. Her inability to bear children was not just a physical affliction, but a spiritual one, and the deep emotional pain she experienced as a result shaped her into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. In her heart, there was always a longing for the joy and fulfillment that came with motherhood, but when that longing went unanswered, it turned into something far more dangerous, a desire for retribution that would forever alter her path. The tragedy of Abyzou lies in the fact that her jealousy was not simply born of spite or malice. It was rooted in profound pain. Her infertility made her feel incomplete, and in a world where women's value was so closely tied to their ability to bear children, Abyzou became a reflection of the harsh societal pressures placed on women. Her inability to fulfill what society saw as her most important function created an inner turmoil that would drive her to darkness. The myth suggests that Abyzou's jealousy was not something that she chose to embrace, but something that overwhelmed her as a result of her emotional and physical suffering. Rather than finding peace or resolution in her condition, she was consumed by her grief. It was this grief that gave birth to her destructive nature, and it was this grief that ultimately turned her into a malevolent force that would prey upon the most innocent and vulnerable. In her desire to become a mother, Abyzou's envy became a torment that could not be escaped. She was not simply envious of the mothers who had the children she could not have. She was also envious of their connection to the divine. Fertility in the ancient world was often viewed as a gift from the gods, and to be fertile was seen as a blessing that came with both physical and spiritual significance. To Abyzou, the mothers who could bear children were walking embodiments of the divine favor she had been denied. In her mind, their fertility was a cruel reminder of everything she lacked, and the very act of motherhood became something that filled her with bitter resentment. Her inability to experience this divine blessing warped her perception of the world and led her to believe that she was entitled to the same joys as those who were able to conceive. But instead of seeking to understand or come to terms with her situation, Abyzou chose to lash out against those who seemed to have what she could never possess. This jealousy led to a form of obsession that consumed Abyzou. Her mind, once capable of more complex thoughts and emotions, became singularly focused on her hatred for those who could bear children. It is in this obsession that the truly terrifying nature of Abyzou's character is revealed. She no longer saw the world as a place of balance, but as a place in which she had been wronged, and in her mind, the only way to restore balance was through retribution. Her resentment grew over time, and as she sought to satisfy her thirst for vengeance, she targeted those who were most vulnerable, women in the throes of pregnancy or the early stages of motherhood. She became a specter that haunted the moments of joy and hope that were supposed to accompany the arrival of a child, bringing instead grief, pain, and loss. Her attacks were not sporadic or random but calculated, aimed at the very heart of the family unit, a source of all human joy and future potential. Abyzou's jealousy had driven her to seek destruction not only for herself but for others, and in doing so, she became a reflection of the destructive power that unchecked jealousy can hold. Abyzou's jealousy, though rooted in personal trauma, was also amplified by her deep sense of alienation. Her infertility made her an outsider in a world that placed so much value on motherhood, and as she became more and more consumed by her envy, she began to see herself as separate from the very fabric of society. This alienation was not just physical, but spiritual. She was excluded from the most sacred and divine aspects of existence, and in her mind, the only way to bridge the gap between herself and the world of mothers was to tear it down entirely. Her actions were not just the acts of a bitter woman seeking revenge, but the desperate actions of a creature who felt entirely cut off from the world and the divine forces that governed it. The jealousy that fueled Abyzou's existence was not a passive emotion, it was an active force that drove her to separate herself further from the world around her, until she was nothing more than a shadow of destruction, consumed entirely by her desire to undo the blessings she had been denied. Abyzou's role as a demon of miscarriage and infant mortality is not just an expression of her own personal agony, but a reflection of the ways in which death and suffering were often attributed to supernatural forces in the ancient world. In a time when the causes of miscarriage and infant death were not understood, it was easy for people to imagine that such tragedies were the result of malevolent spirits or gods. Abyzou, as a creature of darkness born from the very depths of human suffering, was the perfect embodiment of these fears. She represented the unknown, the unseen forces that could strike at any moment, causing the unthinkable to happen. Her power over life and death was not simply a metaphor for the fragility of existence, but a direct representation of the uncertainty and fear that women faced when they carried life within them. The presence of Abyzou in the myths surrounding miscarriage and infant death also highlights the vulnerability of women during childbirth and pregnancy. In the ancient world, these events were fraught with danger, and the fact that a figure like Abyzou could hold such power over them speaks to the very real fears that people had about the process of reproduction. Women could not control whether or not they would experience the joy of motherhood, nor could they always control whether their pregnancies would come to fruition. In this sense, Abyzou became a symbol of that very powerlessness, and her jealousy embodied the fear that even when women could bear children, they were still vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The idea of a demon like Abyzou attacking a pregnant woman or an infant was a reflection of this fear, a way for people to give shape to the inexplicable and terrifying events that could unfold during this most vulnerable time in a woman's life. Abyzou's jealousy also stands as a warning about the dangers of letting emotions such as envy consume one's soul. While it is understandable that a woman in her situation would feel pain and resentment, Abyzou's decision to let those feelings dictate her actions transformed her into something monstrous. She became a creature whose sole purpose was to cause suffering and destruction, and in doing so she lost the very humanity that might have helped her find peace or resolution. In the end, Abyzou's story is one of tragedy, not just because of her own personal loss, but because of the way in which her jealousy led her to become a force that took the lives of others. Her inability to process her grief in a healthy way turned her into a demon, and in her mind, there was no path back from that. Her jealousy had consumed her completely, leaving no room for redemption or reconciliation. Abyzou's journey is a tragic commentary on the consequences of allowing envy and bitterness to rule one's life, and the damage that such unchecked emotions can wreak not only on oneself but on others as well. At the heart of Abyzou's story lies the question of how far a person will go when consumed by their own suffering. Abyzou's transformation into a demon was not a decision made out of rational thought, but a descent into darkness fueled by pain, loss, and jealousy. She represents the dangers of allowing personal suffering to morph into something far more dangerous, something that can destroy not only the person who carries it but the very world around them. Abyzou's jealousy was not merely an emotional reaction, it was the destructive force that drove her to become a creature of vengeance, and in doing so she became a symbol of all the destructive potential that lies within the human psyche when it is left unchecked. Abyzou's dark legacy is not simply an abstract myth or a mere reflection of ancient fears about miscarriage and infant mortality. Her transformation into a malevolent demon rooted in envy has deeper implications about the nature of suffering, the human condition, and the potential for trauma to shape both individuals and societies. Throughout the mythos surrounding her, we see how her envy isn't just a personal flaw, but something that grows out of universal human vulnerabilities, fear of inadequacy, the pressure of unfulfilled desires, and an overwhelming need to belong or be validated by the world around us. While her story may be ancient, the essence of her torment still speaks to contemporary struggles with identity, value, and the invisible forces that drive individuals to act against others in destructive ways. Her story is thus more than an isolated myth. It's an allegory of the dangers of unchecked emotional pain, the devastating effects of unresolved grief, and the deep need for empathy and healing within the context of community and society. At the core of Abyzou's character lies the tragic aspect of her inability to bear children, a deeply personal, emotional, and physical affliction that transcends simple envy or jealousy. Her inability to fulfill the role of motherhood, a societal and divine expectation, became a defining element of her existence. The myth tells of her becoming a demon who steals the lives of infants, a creature of destruction born of her rage at being denied what others possess. However, at a deeper level, Abyzou's trauma runs far deeper than envy of others' children. Her infertility represents the torment of exclusion from something sacred and powerful, the generative forces of life itself. To be unable to bear children in ancient times was more than just a personal shortcoming. It was seen as a denial of one's womanhood, of one's place within the cycle of life. Her envy then was not simply about others' joy, but about her own exclusion from the very fabric of existence that ties people together in the cycle of life and death. This notion of exclusion from the divine cycle of creation is pivotal in understanding Abyzou's transformation from a mortal woman to a demon. In many cultures, women's value was directly tied to their fertility and their ability to give birth, which became both a symbol of personal worth and a divine connection. When Abyzou was denied this connection, she felt herself severed from not just the human world, but from the divine itself. Her envy was thus a response not only to the lives of others, but to the fundamental spiritual estrangement she experienced. This form of alienation was more than physical, it was a rejection of her inherent worth, as defined by a society that saw a woman's worth as inherently linked to her capacity to create life. Her jealousy grew into something more than just a petty emotion, it was a denial of her very identity and worth. The myth of Abyzou reflects how individuals in society can sometimes experience profound pain that is rooted in external judgment and societal expectations. Her infertility, while deeply personal, becomes a metaphor for anyone who feels excluded or oppressed by societal norms that dictate one's value based on external factors, be it beauty, fertility, wealth, or other measures of worth. Just as Abyzou could not bear children, there are others who may feel that they too cannot meet the expectations placed on them. In modern times, this can reflect feelings of inadequacy in the face of impossible standards of success, beauty, or family roles. The destructive power of envy in Abyzou's case, though, is a powerful illustration of what happens when one internalizes societal judgments and allows them to consume their sense of self. In her myth, she loses her humanity by turning her pain outward against the very thing she craved, motherhood itself. Her transformation into a demon of revenge illustrates the consequences of allowing inner pain to fester and distort one's sense of justice and worth. Abyzou's jealousy, which begins as a response to her infertility, spirals into violence against others, and this makes her story all the more chilling. The jealousy that drives her to kill infants and cause miscarriages becomes an act of vengeance that is not only destructive but also deeply tragic. This kind of emotional devastation is often projected outward, as Abyzou's deep sorrow over her inability to conceive is channeled into destruction. This shift from personal grief to outward aggression is emblematic of how unresolved emotional pain can mutate into harmful behaviors that affect others. When people internalize unresolved suffering, they often find themselves acting out in harmful ways, sometimes without understanding the origins of their pain. In Abyzou's case, her pain and jealousy became a source of power, and she used this power to destroy the very thing she most desired: motherhood, family, and the continuity of life. Abyzou's jealousy could have been tempered or even overcome had she found a way to reconcile with her own sense of worth. Yet rather than seeking compassion or support from others, she chose to isolate herself in her grief, and in doing so she began to embody the destructive force of envy. Her myth thus serves as a stark reminder of the importance of addressing grief and pain in a healthy way. When these feelings are left to fester, they can warp a person's sense of self and drive them to hurt others. Abyzou's story also warns against the danger of unchecked rage, especially when it is motivated by feelings of inadequacy. She could have used her grief as an opportunity for growth and healing, but instead it became the fuel for her destructive path. This emphasizes the necessity of having mechanisms of support, understanding, and empathy in communities, so that individuals don't fall prey to the dark allure of resentment and vengeance. Moreover, Abyzou's vengeful actions raise another critical question about the consequences of trauma and its long-term impact. Her tragedy lies not just in her own suffering, but in the way that suffering manifests itself externally, affecting the most innocent and vulnerable. In her pursuit of retribution, Abyzou's capacity for empathy and compassion was obliterated. Her transformation into a demon was marked by a shift from feeling victimized to becoming a victimizer, a tragic irony that highlights the cyclical nature of suffering and revenge. This illustrates how trauma can sometimes ripple outward, creating more victims and perpetuating a cycle of harm. In Abyzou's case, her refusal to confront her own grief led to further harm, making her both a symbol of the destructive potential of pain and a reflection of how trauma can echo through generations, affecting others in the process. The myth of Abyzou also presents a fascinating exploration of the dynamics between the physical and the spiritual realms. Her role as a demon who causes miscarriage and infant death positions her as an intermediary between the world of the living and the divine realm of the gods. Her actions are seen as a manifestation of divine anger or malevolent influence. In many ancient mythologies, supernatural beings like Abyzou were often thought to be able to move between the worlds of the living and the dead, embodying the idea that life and death were inextricably linked, and both were in the hands of powerful, often capricious forces. Abyzou's role as a spirit that crosses between life and death emphasizes this connection and serves as a reminder of how death, suffering, and misfortune often seem arbitrary and beyond human control. While modern science provides explanations for miscarriage and infant mortality, these events were once attributed to supernatural forces, with figures like Abyzou embodying the unknown causes of human suffering. While Abyzou's myth is one of darkness and vengeance, it also hints at the complexity of grief and the need for compassionate responses to suffering. Abyzou's journey from a mortal woman to a demon consumed by envy is ultimately a tale of loss of her children, her connection to society, and her humanity. In understanding Abyzou's transformation, we are reminded that grief, when left unchecked, can create monsters out of the most human of emotions. Her story calls for empathy, understanding, and a recognition that even the most destructive figures are often born of unhealed wounds. By exploring the depths of Abyzou's pain and how it manifested in her as a being of destruction, we not only gain insight into the ancient worldview, but also into the ways in which unresolved trauma continues to shape the modern world. In this way, Abyzou's myth, tragic and terrifying as it is, offers an important lesson: the need to face our wounds before they destroy not only ourselves but others as well. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Like and subscribe for more, and stay curious.